Hello and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year's packed a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with free and inclusive resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2024 conference brings you this session, Show and Tell, What Works and What Writers Get Wrong. If you want more content similar to this topic, you can also check out the Word Nerd Cafe episode 18, How to Show Conflict, Showing versus Telling Body Language from the 2020 conference, and a whole variety of this year's panels. I'm Exum Moon. I'm going to be your moderator for this session, and we'll go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves. Who wants to go first?
Someone's gotta go. Hi, I'm Megan. Megan Bontrager. I got the right hand that time. My debut novel was released on April 15th. It's called Eye of the Ouroboros. I'm a horror and SFF author based currently in Ireland. I don't sound like it. I'm a PhD student, about halfway done with my dissertation, so I'm almost there. It's my second year here at WriteHive, and I am just tickled to be back with everybody.
Well, hello. It's great to be with everyone. My name is Tatiana, and I write diverse characters slaying dragons, so I'm all in the fantasy room. I have a completed duology out, but my most recent book is Sister Samurai, which is a Afro Samurai meets Sword of Kaigen anime-inspired novella. And yeah, I'm glad to be here with everyone.
Awesome. I'll go next. I'm Jill too. This is my third year at WriteHive. I think it's my first year with an actual cover, which is great. And I'm based in Atlanta. I am predominantly a YA sci-fi author. I have my debut, The Dividing Sky, coming out this fall with Penguin Random House. It's a YA dystopian romance about a girl who uses her neurochip to illegally deal happy memories, and the handsome rookie determined to arrest her. It's been called like a cozy dystopian, which is pretty fun. And then I actually just announced in April, this next April, I've got a book coming out with Disney, a middle grade called Kaya Morgan's Crowning Achievement. And that is not speculative, but it is about a young girl competing to be crowned queen at her local Renaissance Festival summer camp. So it's definitely in like the nerd, like speculative adjacent realm.
All right. I guess it's my turn. My name is Tyler Wittkofsky. I am a multi-genre author. I actually have not published a book in the same genre as any of my other ones yet. So I just keep on trying new things and love being able to put out different stories. This is my third year with WriteHive, I believe. So I'm really excited to be back this year. And I am also the president and publisher of Tea with Coffee Media, a small independent press that focuses on small voices and new authors.
Amazing. Very excited to talk with you all about our topic today. And to get us started, we'll go with the easiest or hardest question, depending on how you look at it. How do you define the difference between showing and telling?
Well, I feel that telling is primarily using exposition to convey the story, but whereas showing is you're using description, you're using action, using dialogue, all these things to kind of show to convey the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah, the best, I can't remember, I wish I could remember who said this, but the best description I ever heard for showing versus telling was prove it. So don't just tell me that the main character is selfish, like prove it through the way that she acts, what she thinks about, what she says. Don't tell us the woods are creepy, have the main character think about how they remind them of like shriveled up fingers, right? Showing is using details to evoke like a deeper understanding than just kind of telling them on the page, like, oh, this is how it is.
I feel like showing also evokes it's establishing a sense of place, and really rooting the reader in that sense of place, like sensory details and emotions and things like that. And I feel like it's necessary to have that in order to allow the telling to work effectively.
Mhm.
Jill, I absolutely love the prove it statement. I think that's a great way to put it out there. But I think relying on your senses. I'm a big senses person, especially with mental illness and sensory therapy, but relying on your senses while you're writing and putting those senses out there and letting people feel it, letting them see it, letting them smell it, letting them hear it, instead of just telling them what's going on, letting them experience what's going on.
Exactly, yeah. And then I guess kind of with that, because we've all heard the show versus tell advice. We've all heard get the senses involved, things like that. But how do you think the phrase show versus tell has led to confusion among writers and critiquers?
I know for me personally, whenever I first started off writing, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, writing for a more than a hobby, it was really confusing because I wasn't sure what it meant. And I think a lot of beginning writers don't know what it means. And so I think we get kind of so embossed in this, we know what it means and we just say it instead of explaining it. And I think that's something that a lot of critique readers and we really encourage our editors at Tea with Coffee Media to be a little more specific with what they say, give examples, show them ways that they can do it. So being able to, take somebody by the hand and guide them through that process instead of just throwing it out there and say, hey, show versus tell, instead of saying, hey, here's a way you could show versus tell for this particular scene.
And I think there's kind of also confusion on both sides sometimes with the readers and the critiquers, or, your critique partners on show versus telling and what's best for show versus telling. Because you do kind of get this common misconception that showing is absolute, like everything should be showing. And that's not always the case. There are instances where you do want to tell within a story.
I agree with that completely. I feel like it's the verses that kind of muddles everything up. I feel like it should be showing or telling, because the way that it's phrased, it's like, okay, you can only have one or the other, or you're doing it wrong. I feel like they both feed each other a little bit and then complement each other, but it's the saying verses is what confuses people, I think.
For sure. That's a really good point. I think as an author, you have to think about like what you're trying to do, right? Like, what do you want the reader to know? What do you want them to feel? And there's like different levels to it. Like, I think Tatiana's right. Like, you don't have to just describe everything, right? Like, if the point you're trying to make is that like somebody's so sad that they won't get up to like turn on like the heat in their room, right? Like, you could say like the room was cold, right? And that tells us that like the person is going through something like really deep emotionally. If you just want to say if you're trying to tell the reader that the room is cold, you might go into more detail and say like it's frigid, like a chill of whatever. But all that might not be necessary if you're trying to prove a bigger point about, what the character is going through or what's happening at that point in the story.
So Tatiana mentioned one of the misconceptions is that you have to show everything. What would you say are some other common misconceptions about showing and telling to get that verses out of there?
At least when I'm looking at a lot of beginner writer work, there tends to be the verses turns to and sometimes they'll show something and they'll tell it. And sometimes that can be really repetitive and you don't actually have to do both very often. And I find that using beta readers, that helps a lot because they will point out like, we understand, we get it. And a lot of the times authors do this because they're not really confident in their writing and they're not sure, did I get my point across in this scene? But sometimes having outside feedback will help you know that, yes, you got your point across. You don't have to tell us again.
I feel like you're so right, though, that it's the lack of confidence that that really kind of gets people when it comes to showing and telling. Because I think when I started, I wanted to go full Lord of the Rings with descriptions and like every little bead of sweat meant something. And I just had to really linger in every single sensory moment. But I felt like, okay, everything that I'm writing is coming out Greek. So I need to just state right away, this is what we're feeling, this is what we're doing, and I'm gonna take you there now. And that's just, I felt like that was a crutch that never really worked. And as soon as I felt like I could actually use the sense of place and the sensory details and all of that to really show something, the telling kind of came naturally at times when I needed to speed up the pace or move along, but yeah, your confidence is totally a big part of it. You're so right.
Yeah. And it does happen the most like at the beginning, right? When you have all that exposition and things you like need the reader to know. You have this urgency of like, you have to get this world before we can like go on the adventure. Yeah, for me, I find especially in those early chapters, it helps to make like literally like a list for myself of the things that the reader needs to like know or how they need to feel about a certain situation or a certain character. And then think about ways I'm going to show those things, right? Before I even start drafting. it helps make sure that like all those extra words I do add, because you want the sensory detail and stuff, are actually in service of like the most important pieces of the story.
Yeah, that's a great tip because I know even specifically in fantasy genre, it's very we're a lot of info dumping oftentimes in fantasy accused of it. And while sometimes genre does lend to a higher tolerance of that balance between showing and telling. So there might be a higher tolerance for info dumping because there's a lot you have to get across to the reader before, really getting to the meat of the story. But, like there's definitely ways, as Jill said, which was a really great tip, kind of writing that list of the things that you need, and kind of going from there.
Yeah, I think Megan really touched on a good point too, is making sure it flows naturally. Because that's one thing that I try to do with my writing is, put everything down on the paper the first time through. It doesn't have to be right. But whenever I go through the first, second, third rounds of edits, self-edits, then that's whenever I'm like, okay, this doesn't seem quite right. This doesn't flow naturally. So being able to determine what flows and what dams up the actual story to prevent it from moving forward. That's such a crucial piece because I think we forget about that sometimes.
Yeah, you have a really good point. Like that kind of that balance between showing and telling, like it really affects pacing a lot
Hmm.
within the story. And it's very interesting because pacing is very subjective to different readers based on different genre, based on different readers. So kind of getting that balance sometimes is how the flow of the story and how is most effective with the pacing for the story.
It's interesting that what people expect from the pacing and showing and or versus telling changes based on genre, but also like subgenre, like micro genres. There was this meme going around for a while that was so accurate. It was a spectrum, and on one side was gothic horror, and the other side was cosmic horror. And the gothic horror was like, I'm gonna explain everything, whether you want me to or not. And then cosmic horror was like, I don't even know what's going on. So it's I live on the cosmic horror side of things, so who knows? But it's interesting what people expect to get from the what you're shown and what is kind of left nebulous and left up to your interpretation, even within just the smallest niches of genre.
Yeah, so it is really important to know what genre you are writing in. And I know that's sometimes very hard when you start like putting a story down on the page and you're like, I don't know what this is, but we'll find out later. But sometimes, you have the story that you have, and then you start doing your research. Okay, what type of story this is? What is the audience? What do those books look like in returns to pacing and the pacing and showing and telling? Because sometimes it's just a matter of audience expectations, what works and what doesn't.
That's so real. You guys have me thinking about like age categories too. So like I read a lot of sci-fi, like both in young adult, but also in adult. And when I was drafting my debut, like one of the biggest points that my editor worked with me on was like that exposition, like a little bit more telling actually, because, A, you have younger readers, but B, because they're so young, it might be a lot of readers' first time picking up a science fiction book. And you don't want to like overwhelm them with all this world building, all this terminology. And kind of scare them off from the rest of the story. So I think that's one case where you have to be kind of thoughtful about your audience and where they might be entering into that genre from, the kind of their like past context and past experiences with books, and maybe lean a little bit more on, not overly explaining, but being very clear on, exactly how your world works so that they can understand the rules to understand how to play by the rules later in the story.
It's not one of our questions, but you've all kind of touched on it a little bit. What would be some of your advice for especially newer writers as they're going through the drafting process, from going from, here's everything that I'm telling you, here I'm info dumping everything, to identifying places that they can show more and how to show more. So kind of that, drafting and editing pipeline of here's everything on the page to here's something that's actually gonna make sense and resonate with readers as a story.
I would definitely consider what the story is about because that does change your focus and your focus is really where you want to show things. So for example, if you're writing a coming of age story, you want to show your MC's growth. You don't want to like repetitively tell them. So it definitely depends on what story you have, as we have talked about before, different subgenres. So considering where that focus is, and that's what you really want to show.
As a dystopian romance and sci-fi romance author, like I never ever tell romance, like I never tell the romance arc, because you need your reader to come along with you on that journey and swoon when the main character swoons and gasp when the main character gasps. And all of that is so important, right? Like it's my biggest pet peeve when authors are like, oh, like she felt so strongly for him. It's like, did she? Because like I don't see why. Like prove to me that like this person is a love interest that is worthy of my time. So that's, I think, really important. And I think like related to that too is just like the vibes and the promise of your premise. So when you're thinking about what to show versus tell, like one of my favorite parts of my like writing process is when I have like the rough idea for a story, I'll draft it up like a little, like almost like a query letter, like a little pitch, and send it over to friends and ask them like, okay, like what would you expect in like the fun and games part of this book, right? And like you want to just nail all the vibes, right? Like all the fun things. It's like I'm thinking ball gowns, I'm thinking spaceship battles, I'm thinking, whatever it is. And those are the parts that you want to make sure you put in your book, but also like tease or kind of tee up like as early as possible for readers when they're getting through all that exposition, that they have those like yummy parts to kind of look forward to.
To piggyback off of what you said, I think it's a great idea to start with like, okay, what's the emotion that I want to convey here? Love, affection, romance. And then you figure out what you want to show in order to convey that emotion and to make that emotion permeate the scene, no matter what's going on in the scene. And then I feel like for me on a technical level, it just kind of can web out from there. Like you start with the core vibe, like you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
Vibes are so valid. People don't talk enough
They are,
about
they get a
just
bad
the
rap. I
vibe.
used to be like I used to like think really, I was like, oh, vibes, like I have Save the Cat, I don't need vibes. Like you need vibes, like you
You
really,
do
really
need
do.
vibes.
Yeah.
So you need like the core heart of the vibe. And
Yeah.
then once you spider your way out from that into the bigger world of the scene and the setting and what's the temperature and is it hot? Is it cold? Everything starts with the core of the emotion and what can you show in order to amplify that emotion and make it permeate everything. The vibes.
I've got a sticker on my laptop that I look at quite frequently, and it says, "Don't get it right, just write." And I think that's some of the best advice that I can give is it doesn't have to be right the first time. I mentioned this earlier, but use your self edits to go through and figure out where you can best put in the show, where you can best put in the tell, where it flows. Because while you're writing it, it seems to flow pretty well because you're writing it, but once you go back and read it, then you see spots where, ooh, that doesn't flow well, or ooh, that doesn't mesh well with the story. So let me change that and make this more sensory developed. So being able to just get everything down on the paper and then go back and reevaluate what you need to do, because it's really really hard to do everything right the first time. And I mean, I would say nearly impossible to do everything right the first time. So being able to go back and do your self edits and know that whenever you go back you can change these things and make these flow edits and make these plot edits and be able to get back on track is crucial.
Yeah. And also after you do that first draft and you have everything down, you can kind of go back and consider how you can show from different levels. You can show from the sentence level, but you can also show from the scene level, and you can show from the whole arc and the whole book level, like what you're trying to say. So you can kind of go back and say, okay, what do I want the scene to say? What do I want the book to say? And kind of think about it in layers.
I'm gonna butcher this. Oh, that's a great way to introduce something. I'm gonna butcher this. But there was, I think it was on Threads or something, maybe like a few months ago, an author that came forth like saying that like she was like, in addition to being a creative fiction author, she, had studied, other works and was kind of like studied in like nonfiction and like research papers and stuff, and basically said that like when she thinks of like drafting books, like it's a thesis statement, right? Like there's some sort of like argument she's putting forward on whether it's romance, whether it's like, about love or about self-worth or, whatever the character's journey is. And your job, scene by scene and, chapter by chapter is to create like your argument for what you're putting forward, right? Like every interaction, every plot point, every character epiphany is leading to that, and you really want to make those as compelling as possible. And so, while you might be telling a little bit of that, like, if you just spit out some like random piece of wisdom in someone's face, like they might hear it, but are they really going to like feel it? And you really want your reader to feel it at the end of the day when they close that book.
Jill, that's a great point. You want, I think some of the best books that we read are the ones where whenever we close it, we feel like we've lost a best friend out of, because we don't have anything else to do. So great
Yeah.
point, Jill.
So that kind of brings me to another question I want to touch on, especially because Tyler's touched on it and then Jill kind of hit it with the, oh, she's so in love with him. Is she? Is she really?
Right.
What are some examples of ways that writers maybe tell things a little too directly to the point that it kind of undercuts what they're trying to get across, that they tell you so many times that she heard this, she saw this, she felt this in those exact words, trying to show you things, but it actually takes you away from the story as the reader. Reassess and reevaluate and kind of restructure that.
One thing that I've seen, I'm big into the mental illness, mental health awareness scene. And so I see a lot of people using like panic attacks, for example, and just saying that they had a panic attack instead of describing the symptoms of a panic attack. His heart began to race, the sweat bubbled up from his brows. Just going from each level and showing the development of the panic attack or anything else that comes, any other physical reaction that comes from an invisible disability. So and that comes from, if you don't experience those things and you don't know people who experience those things, you've got to do your research. You've got to look into what it is that causes these things. What are the symptoms of these different physical reactions? And I think what Jill was saying earlier with the romance aspect, we have to draw on our own life experiences too. But if we don't have those, then talk to other people, do your research. I think research is so, so important that we forget often that we need to do research because we draw on our personal experiences so much that we forget that there are things out there that we don't know.
I think sometimes as writers we kind of like lose focus. For example, in romance where we'll like they'll get distracted by other things and forget about the romance, and they'll just tell us, and it's like, well, no, this is what we need to spend the time on. This is what we need to start developing. In my duology, I actually challenged myself to write a romance, but the language in this world had no word for love. So it's like, okay, can I show the readers that these two characters are falling in love without them ever saying the word? And I think it was successful, but kind of just showing characters together and their relationship and what they're going through, and even just through the entire book can be successful. Can be successful.
That's so cool. Yeah, I think one tricky one, I think, is showing those like physical reactions, right? Like his pulse began to race, or her I'm like I'm the queen of arching a brow, right? Brows are arching all over my my books. But I will say that I think it's dangerous to lean too much on those physical reactions and responses, because as a reader, if you're not feeling those things, you're like, well, my pulse isn't racing. Like I don't feel anything right now. And I think sometimes you can lean too heavily on those physical responses that actually serve to separate, like, and create distance between the reader and the book. I think inner monologue and like is underutilized like a bunch, right? I think like there's so much potential in that for like really like literally getting into the main character or the POV character's head, what they're thinking in that moment, right? Like if like, to use your point, Tyler, of like, panic attacks, like, for those of us who've had panic attacks, like that feeling of like like things getting closer and closer, like if you can talk about that, like what it feels like to feel like you can't breathe, and like like there's like some sort of like phrase or something, like just repeating in your head over that stream of consciousness can actually create a much more like claustrophobic feeling than describing like clammy hands or whatever the case may be, right? Like if you can really show someone what it's like to be in the head of somebody who's feeling that way, or the head of someone who's falling in love, I think that can do a better job of transporting the reader to that situation sometimes than describing a physical phenomenon that they might not have had any experience with.
It's a good point saying that sometimes leaning too heavily on the physical can be alienating. I think as someone who really enjoys a lot of horror, I feel like when I get pulled out of a moment that's supposed to be really scary and tense is when, you know, the narrative focuses solely on the protagonist and how scared the protagonist is, and maybe they're doing a great job of showing it and how it's manifesting in the protagonist's body, but there needs to be kind of a cause and effect, like an outside versus inside push and pull between, you know, what is this external thing that's happening, show us that, and then balancing it with the internality of it, because once you get so into, okay, this person is scared, but what's the monster doing out there? So there just needs to be some balance, or I think it can just get kind of tedious at times and alienating, like you said.
Megan, you brought up an interesting point about that, the outside versus the inside. And this is almost a question I kind of came up with on the fly, thinking about it. What point of view do you normally write in, and how does that impact how you show versus tell?
I usually write in first person. I've been trying third person, and it is really hard. So anyone who does that successfully, I bow to you. I like first person because I feel like it's cheating almost, because it's gonna be internal monologue as a baseline. So you know, you can really get the internal voice, and like Tyler was saying, you know, the uh like thoughts coming fast and quick and muddled, and then that is a direct reflection of what's happening on the outside, whereas, you know, people who are writing in third person are doing it all from all directions. So I feel like if in first person, for me anyway, it's very easy to just be so constantly rooted in the internality of what this character is feeling at all times, so then I can spend a lot of time and a lot of energy putting so much sauce, I guess, onto showing what's happening on the outside, because it's gonna automatically reflect in the first person narration.
Yeah, I also write in first person, and I feel exactly the same way, Megan. Like it's it is like cheating. It's like I can just like say what this person's thinking, and then the reader will. But yeah, I think like I like being that close and kind of getting that really close internal sense of what that character is going through. I think it does it is tricky though, as far as like the exposition, right? Because there's all these things that your main character will know about their world that they would never just think to themselves, like, oh, you know, the hovercrafts run on this kind of power. And it's like, well, that's not something that a normal person thinks on an average day. So you do have to be a little bit creative with how you show those sort of like baseline, like table stakes aspects of your world if you're thinking about something, you know, more speculative.
I've actually written from both. My first series is third person limited, and this book up here is in first person. And it was particularly the needs of the genre. So for example, Sister Samurai is more action fantasy. So to show that action, to show how that action is affecting the character, I chose first person because you can use that inner monologue to really go, oh no, what's going on? But whereas my other series is more epic fantasy, is a little bit more bigger in scale. And so the third person was a little bit better for that. And it takes more scene work, more action, more kind of like more higher view of things to kind of show what's going on.
I'm very much like you, Tatiana. I writ my first book was from third person, and my ever since they've pretty much been since first person because, like Megan and Jill said, it kind of feels like cheating because it's a little bit more easier to jump into the character's head. But yeah, I think it's impressive to do it from either point because, especially from third person, because you're really, I feel like there's a disconnect sometimes from the characters if you're not doing it correct. Whereas with first person, you feel really connected to the main character, and then you start to fall in love and have the feelings of the main character for the secondary characters. So being able to balance it out is key.
Wild to me because I can't write in first person to save my life. So that to hear that it's like, oh yeah, I write. I'm like, okay, I'm the weird one here. Because it's funny. I've never been able to get into that good, like, effective showing in first person. Like it feels like telling to me. So that's maybe I'll have to do some more experiments with it. All right. So our last question: What are some of your favorite examples of both showing and telling? What are some books and some stories that get it right?
So I went, like any good dystopian author, I went and I pulled out the Hunger Games because I feel like the first
Yeah.
chapter, and like even the first page of this book is so masterful in how she does this. So I think like if I was going back to my strategy and I'm thinking about like what Suzanne Collins wants us to know in like the first page of this book, right? It's that like Katniss loves her sister very much. Their lives are very hard, and today is the day of the reaping. And when I look at how she does these things, like all of the love for Prim is shown, right? Like they share a bed. The first thing she does is reach for her in the morning. She wanted to kill her sister's cat, but she lets her live. All these things that show, that she has a soft spot for her sister. Her life is hard. Like she shares a bedroom with her mother and her sister, like in this tiny house. Oh shoot, that's my alarm, sorry. She has a bedroom with her mother and her sister in this tiny house. Her mother's face is beaten down, she says. When she's talking about the cat, she says, the last thing I needed was another mouth to feed, right? So we get that like Katniss is the main provider for her family in this world. But there's one example literally where she tells, and it is, today is the day of the reaping. And that I think is done in the very first paragraph. She never tells us what the reaping is. We have no context for this. All we know is that it's something that gives Prim bad dreams. It just creates a tension that we understand immediately that this world is something that we're not quite familiar with, right? And so I feel like there's really intentional use there of showing to evoke the emotions, right? We're sympathetic with Katniss. We feel what she feels for her sister. And also, this one thing that we're like, it's a little like niggling thought of like, but what is the reaping, right? And that creates the tension to kind of keep us reading.
One of my favorites is Madame Eldridge's Wayward Home for Unruly Boys by Benjamin Ryan. He does a really good job of writing in third person and showing and telling adequately to put you in the mind of each character to really showcase how they're feeling and make you feel along with them. Um, he also does a lot of telling, not a lot of telling, but a good amount of telling that gets you to the point where you're like, ooh, what's going to happen next? Kind of like what Jill was saying with the Hunger Games, where it says today is the day of the reaping. And you're like, okay, so what is the reaping? And it gets you kind of on your seat. And you want to know more and you want to keep reading. So I think he does a really good job of doing something similar.
One of and I actually brought an example of telling because we don't have like a lot of good examples of telling usually. And one of my favorite that kind of stuck out to me was from Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian. And it's a very interesting experience when you kind of like go back and read older literature because the rules are a bit different and what the expectations were a bit different. And you kind of see it like how language has changed. But one thing that kind of stood out to me while reading it that was very different from the books that I was currently reading was the use of color. And it just reminded me how in current fiction, we use a lot of metaphors and a lot of specific synonyms to describe color. So like, for example, like the blood was like freshly spilled blood was like crimson, or like the old dry blood was maroon, right? Or even like her hair was the color of a moonless night. But in Conan the Barbarian, it was just like, it's black, it's red, it's green. And, like not having flowery descriptions for color actually didn't take away from the story because that's not what the story was about. So, I think it's just a great example of where, you could just have red and it works.
One that I read recently is I'm really late to this bandwagon, so nobody read me for this. The Six Deaths of the Saint, by Alex Iharo, I think her last name is. It's a short story. Technically, it's like 32 pages long. It's some of the most gut-wrenching writing that I've ever read in my entire life. And it's a whole lifetime in 32 pages. And the way that she zooms in and out of these really visceral, emotional scenes, and then kind of pulls the camera back a little bit, and time passes, but we don't lose anything. We know exactly what's going on. We know where everyone is, what everyone's emotional states are, and then we just get plunked down right back into just a crucial, pivotal moment. And I won't spoil anything because everybody needs to read it. It is a masterwork, I think, in pacing and characterization and doing all of that gymnastics in a very short space, because I feel like with everything that's going on in this story, it very easily could be dragged out to a novel, two novels, multiple. It also very easily could just be like a 10-page short story. But the fact that it's so perfectly balanced with what is lingered on and what is given in broader strokes, it's really well done, I think. Highly recommend.
One of my other favorite examples of showing specifically, and again, it is very dependent on genre, is Peter J. Clarke's The Master of Jinn for historical fantasy specifically. And it's a book where it introduces you to this world where Jinn is introduced in 1860s. And because it's a historical fantasy, every single scene like shows you like how this magical element that's introduced like affects religion, affects politics, affects the fashion, affects just different aspects of the culture. It's just so very well done, showing like how this one element has changed history. Like, it's a very great example of historical fantasy.
All right. Do y'all have anything else fun you want to add about this that we didn't get to talk about? Say, 'cause if not, we're going to ask the most important question, which is, what are you working on now, and where can everyone watching during the conference find you?
So I am working on multiple stories. The first one, or the first series, is the Sons of Poseidon. And it is going to be a 3-book series that I'm releasing as a box set next year. I'm also working on the second book of the Sunflower Kisses series, Love and Growth. And I'm working on Time and Tide, a historical fiction retelling of Blackbeard and Anne Boney. That should be coming out in September of this year. And I've got a couple other ideas that I've started that are nowhere near being done, but my OneDrive looks like it's been shot with ideas. And to find me, I am on any social media pretty much at Tyler Wittkofsky. You can find my website, tylerwittkofsky.com, or the best way to find me, my work, all my businesses, all my links is my link tree, which is linktr.ee/Tyler Wittkofsky.
And I'm currently working on a sword and sorcery adventure that's set in the same world as my duology, but different place in the world. So we get to go see different cultures. And you can find me at play on my name's at Obey, the author, at any social media places, or my website, tatianaobey.com.
I am working on an unannounced prequel of sorts to The Dividing Sky, set in the same world. And what's fun is I've been drafting that at the same time that past pages came through for The Dividing Sky. So I've been getting to put in all these little Easter eggs and all these like kind of tie-ins, and that's been very, very fun, very cool.
Cool.
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at J2TEW Writes, and you can find me on TikTok at Jill2, and my website is www.jill2.com.
And I am working on at the moment a Dante's Inferno retelling, Eldritch horror Dante's Inferno set in a system of collapsed sea caves. Everything horrible that I can imagine. The ocean, caves, just right there. I just turned in revisions for that, but I imagine I will have more work to do. So that. And then I'm also going to be drafting a Southern Gothic cosmic horror set in the swamps soon. Trying to commit to giving myself at least like 3 days off, but you know. I'm on all socials as Meg Bontra, except for TikTok, where I am Book Hag, because why not? I forget that that's my handle sometimes, and then I have to say it out loud in professional settings, and I question all my choices.
Amazing, incredible. Thank you all so much for everything that you had to share today. For everyone joining us during the conference, please feel free to include any questions that you have for our amazing panelists. We'll catch you at the other panels. Thanks so much.